If the 1960s was the decade in which New Zealand's turning away from traditional allegiances and patterns of association first became unmistakably apparent, then the 1980s was the time when new directions were confirmed. The unprecedented disruption wrought by widespread opposition to their 1981 Springbok tour ensured that official New Zealand teams would never again play rugby with South African sides in the era of apartheid. And the 1984 general election turned out to be as much of a watershed for the whole country as those which had brought to power the Liberals in 1891 and Labour in 1935. And again it was Labour who would initiate both the deconstructing and the rebuilding. Sir Robert Muldoon's national government of 1975 to 1984 was the last to involve itself in the New Zealand economy in a big spending and heavily interventionist way. At different points in its term, it imposed a wage and price freeze, controlled rents, directors' fees and dividends, and tried to force down interest rates. It invested heavily and ultimately unsuccessfully in a program to make synthetic petrol, ammonia, urea, and methanol out of natural gas, the so-called Think Big strategy designed to make New Zealand self-reliant in energy and soak up unemployment. And it instituted a superannuation regime that the country simply could not afford. These were all policies and tactics favoured by the man who had chosen to be both Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, and who was so strong-willed that nobody in his cabinet or caucus was capable of challenging him or deflecting policies he was determined to follow. By 1984, Muldoon's hold on considerable power was shaky, however. He had already had to sack one minister, Derek Quigley, for publicly questioning the value of the Think Big strategy and the Prime Minister's insistence on a high level of economic control. Two other National MPs, Marilyn Waring and Mike Minogue, were threatening to cross the floor and vote against the government. And so Muldoon, showing the effects of both illness and alcohol, made an impulsive decision to call a snap election, which the government lost. The swing of the electoral pendulum not only brought Labour to power again for only the fourth time in half a century, but also swept out of office a generation of politicians whose views and values had been formed by the Great Depression and participation in World War II. Ministers in the new government, led by former Auckland barrister David Lange, were mainly in their 40s and brought new perspectives to bear on both government policies and New Zealand's place in the world. They turned away from the kinds of economic strategy that had been standard in New Zealand since the 1930s. One of their number, Michael Bassett, an historian by profession, described their perspective in these terms. The era of big government had largely been played out. The world economic downturn in the 1970s rendered further expensive extensions to the welfare state unaffordable, especially in New Zealand, where poor economic stewardship had caused the country to subside swiftly down the OECD performance ladder. In any event, doubts were growing inside the Labour Party about the effectiveness of big spending. The leader of and major spokesman for the doubters was Finance Minister Roger Douglas, who had a background in business and accountancy. Persuaded by his arguments, the Labour cabinet set in motion reform of the public service, a transformation of some departments into state-owned enterprises charged with making a profit, and the sale of others, such as the telephone and banking sections of the former Post Office, New Zealand Steel and the Shipping Corporation. Where traditional Labour had sought to be as widely involved as possible in the business of running the country, the new Labour government was ready to devolve or sell as much of its inherited business as it could. Economic controls were also shed in an enactment of the kinds of policy that Quigley had been trying to sell to his national colleagues. Agriculture and consumer subsidies were phased out. "It's possible to grow bananas on Mount Cook," Roger Douglas had famously announced, "but is it worth spending the money it takes to do so?" The financial market was deregulated, the New Zealand dollar floated for the first time, controls on foreign exchange were removed, new banks allowed to open their doors. Douglas also introduced a sales tax on goods and services, initially set at 10% and subsequently raised to 12.5%, and a heavy surtax on superannuation, which the previous government had made universally available at the age of 60 and set at 80% of the average wage. The marginal tax rate was reduced from 65 cents in the dollar to 33. The combined effect of all these measures, which amounted to a wholesale adoption of a monetarist program, was eventually to reduce inflation dramatically, bring down national debt, and increase economic growth. Local government, too, was reorganised drastically. As minister responsible for this sector, Michael Bassett reduced some 500 local authorities and special purpose boards to less than 100. Geoffrey Palmer, Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Justice and of the Environment, devised a Bill of Rights to protect civil liberties and the Resource Management Act, eventually passed in the term of the subsequent national government, 1991, to ensure greater environmental protection, more sustainable use of resources, control of development and acknowledgement of Māori traditions and values in local body planning processes. There was a political price to pay for both the scope and the pace of these changes, however. Because of the suddenness of the 1984 election campaign, Labour had not laid out a coherent economic plan for the consideration of voters. The policies that were eventually enacted came as a shock to many Labour supporters and to some MPs and cabinet ministers. Whereas Roger Douglas had been refining his monetarist ideas for years and had presented them previously in an unauthorised alternative budget, many of his colleagues were strong on social policy but economically illiterate. They initially allowed the Douglas-inspired program to proceed because they were ill-equipped to argue with it and scarcely recognised at first the nature of what was occurring. By the time they had concluded that the social cost of the policies was too high, in tearing the heart out of small communities by post office closures and loss of forestry jobs, for example, it was too late. The policies were entrenched. The only other option then became fighting a rearguard action against a program which they and many supporters outside Parliament viewed as inimical to Labour values. Former Labour Party President and by this time backbench MP Jim Anderton left the party over this issue and formed first the New Labour Party and then the Alliance, a grouping of small parties which also included Mana Motuhake and the remnants of Social Credit. In addition, while Labour won re-election in August 1987 with a measure of crossover National Party support, a stock market crash later that year, triggered by falls on overseas markets, resulted in company collapses and a heavy loss of funds by small-scale private investors. This in turn led to a loss of confidence in the government's authority in financial matters. A major split developed too between Douglas, who wanted to press on with deregulation, reduction of the tax rate and asset sales, and Prime Minister Lange, who was becoming less confident about the value and legitimacy of the government's economic program. A powerful orator in the soapbox tradition, Lange had been Labour's greatest asset in 2 successful election campaigns. By 1988 he nursed so many reservations about the effects of his government's policies on traditional Labour supporters that he sabotaged Douglas's introduction of a low, flat tax rate and called for a pause in the programme of restructuring and reform. After more than a year of feuding with Douglas and his strongest supporters, Lange resigned when the Cabinet backed Douglas and one of his associate ministers, Richard Prebble, whom Lange had sacked. The now visibly damaged government staggered on for another year under the leadership of first Geoffrey Palmer and then briefly the more populist Mike Moore. Ironically, the national government that took office at the end of 1990 under the genial farmer Jim Bolger initially persisted with so-called Rogernomics policies under the even more markedly monetarist finance minister Ruth Richardson. Richardson, a conviction politician, persuaded her colleagues to reduce spending on welfare significantly, increase pharmaceutical charges, and charge market rentals to housing New Zealand tenants. In addition, National failed to lift the superannuation surcharge as they had promised because of what they judged to be the parlous state of the economy. The effect on the electorate of successive governments of different colours enacting controversial policies for which they had neither sought nor obtained a mandate was to increase considerably the widespread mistrust of politicians. A poll in 1975 had revealed a 32% public trust of politicians and Parliament, but by 1992 that had dropped to 4%. Calls mounted for electoral reform. After a Royal Commission recommended that a mixed-member proportional system, MMP, like that operating in Germany, would better suit New Zealand's needs, a majority of the electorate voted for that option in a binding referendum in 1993. The national government undertook to implement it in 1996. The new system would provide 120 MPs, up from just under 100, 60 of whom would represent electorates and 60 from party lists. The proportionality of Parliament would be determined by the percentage of party votes won by each party. To win any list seats, a party had either to elect at least one member for a constituency seat or pass a threshold of 5%. Prior to the 1996 general election, there was a good deal of manoeuvring as some MPs defected from established political parties and formed groups which they hoped would be able to garner 5% of the vote. Roger Douglas and Richard Prebble peeled off from Labour and set up the Association of Consumers and Taxpayers, ACT, attracting some support from like-minded former National supporters such as Quigley. At the other end of the spectrum, former Labour MP Jim Anderton welded his group of small parties into the Alliance, which generated policies closer to those of traditional Labour. Breakaway National Māori MP Winston Peters had founded New Zealand First, more conservative than Labour but somewhat more liberal than National, according to conventional political values. Despite a measure of disintegration, National and Labour remained the largest parties in Parliament. The first MMP general election in 1996 achieved some of the advantages claimed for the change of system. The number of Māori in Parliament increased from 5 to 15, leading inevitably to renewed calls for the abolition of the Māori seats. The number of women rose from 21 to 35, and there were 3 Pacific Island MPs and 1 New Zealand Chinese. In addition, a far wider range of political and philosophical views was represented than had occurred under the first-past-the-post system. All these ingredients would make political management a more taxing task than it had been previously. The time it took National to form its coalition with New Zealand First, who held the balance of power with 17 seats, had the effect of eroding public confidence in the new system, however. So did the antics of some of the New Zealand First's MPs, including the party leader, in the years that followed. National dropped Jim Bolger as leader before the government's term was over, in part because it had doubts about the manner in which he was dealing with Peters. He was replaced by Jenny Shipley, a former teacher who had held the health and social welfare portfolios and who then became the country's first woman Prime Minister. But she failed to win a general election as party leader. After falling out with her coalition partner, she kept National in office for a further 2 years by cobbling together a second coalition of New Zealand First fragments and an independent MP expelled from the alliance, and retaining the support of ACT and the One United MP. But the prognosis for both the government and the MMP system was not good by the time of the next general election in 1999. Labour was by this time led by Helen Clark, who had succeeded Mike Moore after he took Labour to a second defeat in 1993. After a shaky start as opposition leader, when it seemed more than once that her colleagues might replace her, she had developed into the most commanding figure in Parliament. It was no real surprise that she led Labour and its pre-announced coalition partner, Jim Anderton's alliance, to victory in 1999. The manner in which the new government quickly completed coalition formalities and the fact that the agreement lasted almost until the following election, when the alliance imploded with internal dissension, went a long way towards restoring public faith in a political system that had been on trial in the previous 3 years and found wanting. Despite the controversies generated by Labour's 1984-90 reforms, few of them were reversed by subsequent administrations. The Bolger national government even retained Labour's anti-nuclear policy, which had forbidden visits to New Zealand ports by nuclear-armed or nuclear-powered vessels. This new strategy, which grew out of a People's Peace movement in the 1970s and 1980s and opposition to French nuclear testing in the Pacific, was strengthened by the considerable overlap in membership between that movement and the Labour Party. It strained relations with New Zealand's traditional allies, Britain and the United States. It also ended, at the insistence of the Reagan-led American administration, New Zealand's participation in ANZUS, and hence in shared intelligence and exercises with American forces. The determination of both David Lange and the wider New Zealand electorate to persist with this policy of independence was only increased when, in 1985, French Secret Service agents sank the Greenpeace flagship Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbour. Both the American and British governments of the time declined to condemn this act of terrorism by one of the leading members of the Western Alliance. New Zealand was learning that there was a price to pay for being independent from that alliance, but it showed no inclination to change its stance in the face of bullying or punishment. Some former ministers in the Lange government hinted subsequently that the government as a whole had never intended, nor had the cabinet, to break the alliance with the United States, an action which inevitably had consequences for trade prospects in addition to defence implications. In their view, the anti-nuclear policy was embraced by the Prime Minister to cement his own ties with the Labour movement, to enter his inheritance as its leader, as Michael Bassett put it. While other ministers were preoccupied with the considerable burden of reforms in their own portfolios, the Prime Minister allowed negotiations with the American administration to drift to the point where the relationship was unsalvageable and the break with ANZUS became inevitable. However much truth there is in that scenario, it is undeniable that other members of the Lange cabinet embraced the anti-nuclear policy and its consequences when they recognised its electoral popularity. Partly because of the falling away from the bilateral defence connection with the United States, New Zealand, through the 1980s and 1990s, became more heavily committed to United Nations-sponsored peacekeeping operations. The country had been involved in such operations before, but only on a small scale, and usually using police or territorials. The scale of involvement increased from the 1980s in both the number of operations and the number of regular Defence Force personnel used in the Middle East, Africa, Asia, the Balkans and the Pacific. Over these 2 decades, New Zealanders earned a high reputation for being good at specific tasks, such as mine clearance and training locals to do this work, and for being skilled in interacting with civilians who had been traumatised by their proximity to armed conflict. The latter success owed something to the hands-on approach by which everyone from senior officers to lower ranks were involved in all duties, and was partly explained by what one commentator called the Māori Pākehā mix and lack of formality. These successes culminated in a large commitment of troops to Bosnia between 1992 and 1996, after the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. 3 army contingents were sent, each 250 strong, the first deployment of New Zealand troops to Europe since World War II. Troops were also committed to East Timor between 1999 and 2002 in what most New Zealanders were prepared to recognise as the country's neighbourhood. This operation involved 6,000 personnel from all 3 New Zealand services. 5 lost their lives, 1 in a militia ambush, 3 as a result of accidents, and 1 from suicide. Despite the cooling of relations with the United States, New Zealand was generally well regarded in multilateral organisations through this period, as shown by its election to one of the UN Security Council rotating seats in the 1990s, and by the election of former Prime Minister Mike Moore to the Director Generalship of the World Trade Organization in 1999, and of former Deputy Prime Minister Don McKinnon as Commonwealth Secretary General in 2000. The position his compatriot Alistair McIntosh had narrowly missed out on 35 years earlier. To those unprecedented achievements, two more could be added. By the early years of the 21st century, two of England's most ancient and revered educational institutions, Eton College and Oxford University, were also headed by New Zealanders, John Lewis and John Hood, respectively. The other international arena in which New Zealand continued to depart from traditional patterns was in seeking trading opportunities with countries outside the United Kingdom. Whereas the percentage of exports going to Britain had been 87.4 in 1940, by the close of the 20th century that had fallen to a mere 6.2. There was a substantial rise in exports to Australia over the same period, accelerated by the closer economic relations agreement from 2.9% to 21.4%, and to the United States, European Community, Canada, Japan and other Asian markets such as China, Taiwan, Korea, Thailand, Indonesia and Malaysia. The relative proportions of commodities sold had also altered considerably. Wool, which had made up nearly 50% of the country's exports in 1880, constituted a mere 2.8% by 1999. Meat was down from 27% in 1940 to a smaller but still significant 13.2% in 1999. And dairy products, butter, cheese and various milk derivatives, made up 23% in 1999, a drop from its 1940 peak of 36%, but again still important. Forestry exports were up to 11.3% from almost nothing 60 years before. Exports of other commodities such as seafood, 5.5%, wine and various pastoral products were also growing. While most New Zealanders who lived overseas did so in English-speaking countries such as the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada and the United States, the ethnic mix of the population within New Zealand was changing, with significant increases in the Asian and Pacific Island populations. While the Pākehā majority made up almost 73% of the total population in 2001, most with British ancestry, and those of Māori descent 18.4%, some other ethnic groups which had not been significant before the mid-20th century were now growing. New Zealand Asians totalled 6% and Pacific Islanders 4.6%. Of those with a Pacific Island background, the largest groups were of Samoan and Cook Islands descent, followed by Tongans, Niueans and Tokoloans. Small Middle Eastern and African communities were growing as New Zealand took a low number of refugees from those regions. Most interestingly, perhaps, the proportion of the New Zealand population born in New Zealand in 2001 was 80.5%, as against 64.8% a century before. The largest portion of those born elsewhere, 6.3%, still came from the United Kingdom, but that was well down from the 29% of New Zealanders born there 100 years earlier. The next largest group in 2001 was the 4.7% born in Asia, up from 0.7% in 1896. This far greater degree of ethnic diversity than the older British Pākehā and Māori New Zealanders had known did create anxiety and insecurity in some quarters, and there were signs that the country's earlier racism towards Chinese immigrants was reviving. There were also occasional disturbances between particular minority groups. But it was Māori who were most affected by the social and political changes occurring in New Zealand at the end of the 20th century. In this sector, the new policy directions, initiated by the Lange-Palmer Labour government and carried on after 1990 by the Bolger National Government, were so extensive as to amount almost to a form of social engineering. In this set of politically bipartisan policies, as many government services as possible, especially those associated with health and welfare and those previously the responsibility of the Department of Māori Affairs, were to be devolved from the public service to iwi authorities. These authorities were to be well-resourced either from state funding or from successful claims against the Crown for breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi. It was also accepted that the state had a responsibility under the Treaty of Waitangi actively to fund the promotion of Māori culture and language, rather than simply allowing them to coexist with mainstream Pākehā culture. As part of these policy shifts, the old Department of Māori Affairs was dismantled and replaced with a slimmed-down Te Puni Kōkiri, or Ministry of Māori Development. A variety of measures contributed to these new directions. One of the most important, as noted earlier, was authorisation for the Waitangi Tribunal to consider claims going back to 1840. This new policy saw the number of claims registered with the tribunal swell from half a dozen in 1984 to almost 1,000 by the end of the century. The largest settlements achieved in the first decade of the new policy were with Tainui and Ngai Tahu for compensation packages of $170 million. Ngai Tahu began a program of judicious investment and commercial activities which immediately began to increase the worth of their assets. Tainui, in part because of leadership disputes and personality clashes, got off to a near disastrous start and lost large sums of money. Another far-reaching policy change affecting Māori resulted from the restructuring of the state sector. The 1986 State-Owned Enterprises Act had given the Waitangi Tribunal power to adjudicate on the status of land being transferred from government departments to SOEs. The following year, in a case arising out of this process, the Court of Appeal ruled that the principles of the treaty override everything else in the State-Owned Enterprises Act, and these principles require the Pākehā and Māori treaty partners to act towards each other reasonably and with the utmost good faith. This decision, and subsequent references to the Treaty of Waitangi grafted onto other bills and amendments to previous acts, such as those governing health, education and conservation, gave the treaty an explicit place in New Zealand jurisprudence for the first time. They also represented an acknowledgement by Parliament that the treaty had not been simply a mechanism for transferring the sovereignty of the country from Māori to the Crown, but that it was now recognised as providing a framework for the present and future relationship of Māori and the Crown, the two treaty partners. While this wide interpretation of the significance of the treaty was broadly accepted by the leadership of the country's two major political parties, it was not without controversy in other quarters. Some conservative politicians complained that the judicial activism of the Court of Appeal had forced Parliament's hand, to which the President of the Court, Sir Robin Cook, replied that it was the responsibility of the courts to give sensible meaning and effect to government legislation. Early in the 21st century, the National Party showed some signs of wanting to retreat from the position it had taken on the issue almost 2 decades earlier. In another major settlement, the national government in 1993 offered Māori the so-called Sealords Deal, by which the Crown purchased 20% of the nation's fish quota for allocation among Māori tribes. In return, Māori were asked and agreed through their tribal leadership to drop treaty-based claims to the country's fisheries resources. The actual distribution was to be carried out by a government-appointed Waitangi Fisheries Commission, which then became bogged down for more than a decade in trying to devise a formula that would accommodate all Māori claims and ensure that some of the multi-million-dollar resource also found its way to urban Māori, who lived outside recognised iwi boundaries and organisations. By the turn of the 21st century, major and irreversible adjustments had been made to the relationships between Māori and Pākehā, and between Māori and the Crown. Māori had become a far more visible component of every aspect of the country's life than they had been a generation earlier, though they were still underrepresented in the professions and higher income suburbs, and overrepresented in crime statistics. Māori elements were increasingly apparent in the arts, literature and rituals of the nation, and beyond. Kerry Hume's novel, The Bone People, had won the Booker Prize in London in 1985. Thanks to MMP, there were now 18 members of Parliament who identified as Māori, rather than the smaller number who had held the specifically Māori seats. For the first time, all the country's institutions were bending slowly but decisively in the direction of Māori needs and aspirations. The momentum of these changes would be maintained, but not without controversy.